Hey everybody, welcome to the Thoughtful Bro. We are here, like always, on Tuesday at 2, streaming on a mighty blaze with Priyanka Champaneri here today. It's going to be an amazing 45 minutes. A few words about the show and about a mighty blaze, as always, before we get started. I'm Mark Cecil, the Thoughtful Bro. I'm here every Tuesday at 2 to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick, always talking to authors who've just released a book. As for a mighty blaze, we're an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually and during COVID and beyond. You can find scores and scores of our interviews on A Mighty Blaze. We probably release anywhere between 6 and 10 new interviews every week. Again, all with recently published books. So as our founder, Jenna Bloom, likes to say, you never have literary FOMO again. So we're not asking for any money at A Mighty Blaze. You can support us by, frankly, just liking us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So just like us, give us a follow. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, which we send out on Sunday, and just which tells everybody what's coming up that week. As I said, again, this amazing author content is 100% free, but if you are in the mood to spend money, you must spend it on beautiful books, important books, fresh books, hot books, rich books, beautifully rendered books like The City of Good Death, which we're going to be talking about in a minute. Please just go ahead, relieve that impulse and make an impulse buy. If you have audience questions, put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Next week, I'll be off, but 2 weeks from today, I'll be with Sanjana Sathian, whose debut novel Gold Diggers is getting all the hype. It was picked up, I just heard from Priyanka, before it even got published. I knew it got picked up, but in fact, it got picked up even before it was published this winter to be a TV show produced by Mindy Kaling. So she'll be on the show when we're back in 2 weeks to talk about her book, Gold Diggers. It's going to be amazing. But on to this week. So our author today is Priyanka Champaneri. She received her MFA in creative writing from George Mason University and has numerous times been a fellow at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She received the 2018 Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing for her book, The City of Good Death, which is her first novel. This richly rendered book is a haunting ghost story of family, love, and loss, and it takes place in the Indian holy city of Banaras in a so-called death hostel on the Ganges River. The Chicago Review of Books said Champaneri, quote, has the confidence of a master storyteller, drawing on the rich literary traditions of Salman Rushdie and Arundhati Roy. Her epic saga will satisfy armchair travelers thirsty for adventure and sick of looking out their windows, which frankly describes all of us in the time of COVID. And Publishers Weekly said, quote, this epic magical story of death teams with life. I couldn't agree more. Priyanka, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's so good to be here. And thanks to A Mighty Blaze and Jenna Bloom.
Yep, it's an amazing thing. I'm so glad you're on the show. I'm so excited. I just love having debut authors on the show. And the book is beautiful. It's amazing. I loved reading it. There's so many reasons why I loved it, and I'll get into it for a second. But before I talk anymore, why don't you just tell us in your own words what the book is about?
Yeah, I mean, you did a great job just now. I'll just kind of enhance a little bit on there that it is set in the holy city of Banaras, which is a real city in India, the city considered to be the most holy to folks who, practice Hinduism. And it's set in a death hostel, which are these very, very bare bones places where folks who feel like they want a death in the city are able to go when they feel like it's their time to go and have a place to stay and shelter while they complete that process. And it follows the manager of this death hostel. And the book opens with a dead body being pulled out of the Ganga River. And nobody knows who he is, where he came from, what he's doing there. But he looks exactly like the manager of this death hostel. So the story follows what turns out to be what their relationship is, and kind of gets into the past of this manager, how he came to be in the city and what he ended up leaving behind when he came.
Beautiful. I love it. I actually love it. It's a classic thriller technique. Throw a dead body on the first page. But this is not a thriller. but it is a great way to start a book. So Priyanka and I before the show were kind of emailing back and forth when I booked her a few months ago. And one thing we got talking about is on my website, I list some of my favorite books. And among them is the Illustrated Mahabharata, which I just love. It's one of my favorite books ever. I know that Priyanka loves illustrated versions of the Mahabharata too. But one thing that I just want to say about the Mahabharata is, of course, I love the classics, I love sacred texts. But in the Western tradition, there's two kind of books that are similar to it, I would say. One is the Bible, and the other is the Odyssey and the Iliad by Homer. But to me, the Mahabharata combines what's best in both of those. I mean, in the Odyssey and the Iliad, you have these great, imaginative, beautiful adventure stories. And then in the Bible, you have all the spiritual reckoning and the spiritual exploration. But in the Mahabharata, you get them both. And I love, kind of right from the cover design, from the title of your book, from just hearing a few sentences about it, the impression I got was, here's an author who's like ready to talk in a kind of beautiful way, in a magical way, about the big issues of life. And I just wanted to know, I mean, you can talk about the Mahabharata, you can talk about whatever you'd like, but I guess might put a real question there for you. It's, is that the kind of author that you really wanted to be, somebody who's just communicating right out of the gate? Hey, I'm here to talk about big issues. I'm here to talk about life and death.
I don't know if it was something that was right out of the gate. I feel like I didn't realize a lot of the big themes that I was writing about, or a lot of these big questions that I was trying to address, until the book was done. And I started, this sounds perhaps a bit ridiculous, but when you see the big trade reviews come in, and you read that beautiful one from Publishers Weekly and from the Chicago Review of Books, it's not until you start reading what other people pick up about the book that you think, oh, well, I guess that is in there. I didn't really realize that. I think if there was anything, certainly death was obviously on my mind, and grief, and the ways in which we mourn, and the ways in which we push through our grief or try to get through our grief. That was definitely on my mind. But the biggest thing was this idea of things are not always as they appear to be, and things are not always as we remember them to be. Memory is something that has really been occupying me of late. This idea that when I was growing up, I was that kid who remembered, I was that really annoying friend who'd be like, remember that thing that we did 5 years ago, and you were wearing this and I was wearing this, and then you said this and this happened. Like I was that friend. And I just had this photographic memory for really interesting, I would just remember like the really weird, interesting things like that. And I think over time, as often happens to young girls, you're told that by the outside world that you're talking too much, that you're expressing too much of an opinion, that there's a certain way to be. And I think in my generation anyway, that certainly happened, where you might be very vivacious in the beginning and you end up kind of closing up as you get older. I think that's changing, hopefully, for this generation. But that's something that happened to me. So like I started kind of fibbing a bit and being like, oh yeah, I don't remember that, even though I remembered perfectly. But what I'm realizing as I get older, Mark, is the holes in my memory, or that two versions of a memory can exist and both can be true. And I think the first moment that happened was probably something very, very not a big deal at all, with a friend, where we were comparing memories of something that we had done. And it was like we had both been in two different places because they didn't match up at all. And yet I don't feel like either of us misremembered. It's possible. But the fact that that was a real awakening for me whenever that happened years ago, to realize that memory is fallible, and the story that you tell yourself is actually not true. And the more you remember it in a certain way, I was talking to another friend who said she read this article by a neurosurgeon or a neuroscientist who said this happens. The more you recall a memory in the way that you remembered and in the way that you think that it happened, you're like almost writing it over and over in your brain to become stronger and to match that. So the more you do that, the further away you're getting from understanding it on a different level or in a different capacity. that I feel like even though I wrote this book and that is a big theme in it, I feel like I'm just now cracking it open for myself and thinking about it constantly, but not something I set out to do intentionally.
It's so fascinating you say that, because there's so many things in this book about life and death and grief and family. But then, and memory is not something that I would have said, but now that you say it, I'm like, huh, the whole book is about memory. Like, that's just, I had the same experience that you had as a writer. I'm like, oh yeah, how did I, it's like, couldn't see the forest through the trees. Like, that's what this book was about.
Yeah.
And I also want to say it rings so true to me that you would have these exact memories the way that you're describing, because that's a lot of how the book reads. One quality of your prose that I really enjoyed is just how seamless it was, and how there would be very long stretches of you describing something, describing a scene, describing an environment, and so on. And it just, you kind of look up and it's like 5 pages later, and it's just seamlessly moved along. And the thread with which you stitch together everything in your book, I think it's a very, it's an incredible talent that you have as a writer.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It wasn't, so this book was actually maybe a third longer than what it ended up being. And there was way more of the atmospheric of the setting. There were way more characters, side characters, and way more of these little side plots, because I love that. I love books like that, books like Midnight's Children and A House for Mr. Biswas and A Suitable Boy, where it's just like, you just get everybody's story. And it doesn't even have to do with the main plot, but you just get it. And lots of times it's really funny, or it's just random, or it's like the small mini bomb that's dropped into the narrative. And then the author's like, off we go. And you're like, wait, no, I'm not done processing this other thing. But that kind of thing is where I really have fun with it. But that seamless quality, it's an incredible compliment, because by the time the book, that first draft, and then all of the entire metamorphosis that it had to go through, all necessary changes, but particularly at the last stretch when I was working with my editor, Nathan Rostron, it was a lot of work, and it got really complicated and really, really crazy and wild at the end, because when you have a lot of characters, a lot of plot points, everything's hinging on everything else. So to change one thing, you're just sending this ripple effect forward, and then you got to figure out how to change everything. And it definitely got overwhelming and scary and terrifying a lot of the time. So just to hear you say that the experience was seamless is the biggest compliment.
Beautiful. Yeah, that was very much my experience. All right, so we're already getting a bunch of questions from the audience, and I want to try to weave those in to the discussion. But I want to talk about, before I get to some of those, the setting of the book, the holy city of Banaras. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that quite right, but it got me thinking. This is one of the holiest cities in the Hindu faith. It's it's in the Mahabharata. I think I heard you say in another interview, it's one of the oldest continuously occupied places on Earth.
I think it is the oldest.
The oldest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a holy city, an important city, an old city, and it just got me thinking. I wonder, in the United States, do we have any holy cities? And quickly, I figured out that we definitely do not. But then, you can't really say that, England or France particularly has a holy city. Not every country does. I mean, and it got me thinking, like, what an interesting thing a holy city is. And I don't think I've ever been to one of the world's great holy cities. And I'm just wondering, is that part of what drew you to this setting, even though I know you've never actually been there?
Yeah.
Just the idea of a physical place that is charged, not just a building, but an entire city, which is sort of charged through with spiritual meaning.
Yeah, I will go back to your idea of America's holy city, Mark, because you had emailed me about this, and it just popped into my head. I was like, what about Vegas? Isn't that like the epitome of for America? Like, isn't that?
That's the best we can do, I think.
That's the best we can do.
It's an evil city, so it's holy in some way.
Only for some people, I guess. But the idea of what drew me to the city, and was it because Banaras is considered that holiest city to Hindus? It's absolutely because of that. But it wasn't simply this idea that this blanket statement that it's considered to be the holiest city. It's because of what Hindus say it does, that if you are fortunate enough to die, to pass away in that city, you will be forever freed from the cycle of reincarnation that Hinduism revolves around. And for folks unfamiliar with that system of belief, it's this idea that, every soul, so not just human beings, but animals, plants, etc., every living being has a soul, and it's capable of going through millions of lifetimes over and over and over again. This cycle of death and rebirth and life continued on and on and on. So if you were to die in the city, you'll finally be freed from that that hamster wheel that just revolves around forever and ever. And that struck me and still strikes me as an incredibly remarkable thing, a massive promise that this city is based on. So the initial curiosity, it was certainly that, but then also before I started, before I had known about Banaras for a very long time because I grew up in a Hindu household. I consider myself somebody who practices a Hindu philosophy in my day-to-day life. So I'd known about Banaras, but never really thought about it beyond that. It was really finding out about the death hostels that was like the thing that lit that match for me. A friend had sent me a link to a Reuters article titled "Check in and Die in 2 weeks" or "Get Out." And it turned out to be about the death hostels. And I'd never, ever heard of them, and instantly was captivated. It made perfect sense to me that such a place would exist, that these places do exist. And the book is set in a fictional one that I made up, but there are several. And there are many ethnographies that have been written about these places. But when you read any of these kind of the research that folks have done who have actually been to these places and interviewed, the people staying there, they don't think there's anything remarkable about it. It's just like they're staying at a hotel or something, and, even the fact that they're there to die, there's nothing remarkable, or it's not like, let's have a moment of silence. This is what we're here to do. Like this kind of gravitas to it. Obviously, there is gravity to the situation, but for the person who is there, oftentimes for the family members who are there, not always, but for some of them, it's very much, this is just a thing that we're doing. We're just here to do it. And that's that. And I think that was really the key point for me, because I understood that as somebody who'd grown up in a Hindu household. But I knew, as somebody who also was born and raised in a Western society in the United States, how strange that also might seem coming at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, and that's absolutely something I wanted to ask you about. I mean, in the United States, we have hospice care. There's an industry, there's certain practices around end-of-life care, but these are medical practices. These are scientific practices. These are not spiritual practices per se. And I totally, that's what you just said is kind of what I imagined the truth might have been, that you saw an absence of this kind of end-of-life spiritual practice here in this culture in the United States. And indeed, I was just wondering, if that was in fact what drew you to it.
It wasn't so much the absence of specifically that, the end-of-life perspective in the United States. It was the absence of any sort of lens, a piece of fiction taking the lens that I had grown up with and that I was accustomed to. I have, again, because I was born and raised and educated in the United States, I have subsisted on a very rich, wonderful diet of Western literature. It's absolutely changed my life. It's absolutely informed my life. But almost 100% of the time, I was contorting myself to adjust to a Judeo-Christian point of view, to understand or appreciate it on a deeper literary analytical level, which was fine. That's kind of what you're getting into when you're reading in English. That's what I had signed up for. But I think, I started writing this book in my last year of graduate school. I think I was just really tired of it. I was really getting wary of it. And not only, it wasn't just so much the reading, but it was in my writing. Having a couple of moments in graduate school where I realized people were applying the same lens of Judeo-Christianity to my work, which had always been there had always been some sort of spiritual thread running through it. And I'd always tried really hard to meet the reader. I feel like the writer has a responsibility to meet the reader on some level, to be like, you're going to enter my world, but I'm at least going to give you the doorways and the windows so that you can make your way around and you can navigate it. But the reader also has a responsibility to the writer too. You know, you can always check out when you're a reader. You don't have to keep reading if you don't want to. But I also don't believe in spoon feeding anybody. So it was a bit of an awakening moment when I realized a lot of people were doing it with my work in these very small, narrow workshops, essentially, and just being tired of it. And when the time came around to start writing my thesis, which ended up being this book, I was like, you know what? F it. I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to write a book for somebody like me, because I know people out there exist. I know there are, like, you know, Hindus living in the United States. But more than that, I knew that there were people who might not be Hindu, but who still were open enough and curious enough to be like, I'm just going to try something new, or I want to learn something new, or I want a viewpoint into this different world. So I think I had come to a point of being slightly fed up. And also, you know, when you're in graduate school, you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing, but finally you get to a point where you're like, I need to take the training wheels off and I'm just going to do whatever I wanted to. And I did. I just felt this wide open, expansive possibility. And you would have loved, I think you would have loved that first draft of the book, Mark, because there were like random ass like references to the Mahabharata, to the Gita, to the Pandavas, to like the Ramayana. There was like all this random shit in there. And I didn't bother to explain any of it. I was like, well, they'll get it if they get it. And if they don't, they don't. And I ended up editing that out only because I was like, this doesn't even fit in the book. Like, why did I put that?
Right. It's, you know, it's really interesting. It reminds me of something that Salman Rushdie said, and I know that he is a very important figure for you. But I heard him say once, just talking about how until he wrote Midnight's Children, he was writing these books that were sort of like, I'm totally butchering what he said, but the gist is books that were like not quite, you know, Indian, not quite honoring his heritage, and like not quite British either. They were sort of like caught in the middle. And he just, when Midnight's Children came along, he's just basically like, F it, I'm just going to own this heritage of mine and just go all in that direction. And as they say, the rest is history.
And he's having so much fun in that book. I know you've heard me say that before, but the reason he's so important to me and Midnight's Children is so important to me is, like, you know, the way I was just talking just a few moments before, it probably sounds like I was all gung-ho and all in and everything. I just decided I was going to do this thing, and then it was just magic from there on out. No. No. It didn't happen that way. You know, I had this article, I had a lot of research that I had done. I had so much anxiety about it because, as you mentioned, I had never been to Banaras. I lacked all of that firsthand experience. And so it took me a really long time to even get started. But once I built up the courage or the confidence or the hubris or whatever you want to say it was, I had an outline of what I thought the book was going to be, and sat down to write it. It didn't want to write itself. It did not want to come. Whatever the outline of the book on paper looked great, but my brain wasn't having it. It didn't want to do it. And it wasn't until I finally picked up Midnight's Children and read it. I have this thing with books where often they'll sit on my shelf for years and I'll pick them up, but it doesn't feel like the right time to read them. Like, I can just feel it. Like, you're going to need this book at a certain point in your life, but that point is not now. So wait. So I had done that with Midnight's Children for quite a while, but that was wise, I guess, because when I picked it up, that's when I needed it. I read it, an instant jolt of electricity, because he's having so much fun. And I think what you just said about him finally realizing that he had been straddling these two worlds for so long, and finally was just like, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I want. That's evident in the pages when you're looking at it, because you can tell he doesn't care about an audience, about who's reading it, about anything. Every single word in there is just purely for him. And I think that's why that book is so magical.
Yeah. Agreed. It is a magical book. Okay. So there's so much in what you just said. I want to ask you a follow-up question on like every other thing you say. But just for a moment, let's just go back to the death hospitals. I'm just so curious. about this idea. So explain it to me. I know how I'm going to sound ridiculous probably, but I just want to understand, like, so it's this thing where somebody's getting close to dying and they go to this death hostel and they have basically 2 weeks ish to live, and they die a good death that will cease the cycle of reincarnation. Okay. So far, so good. But I guess I was just wondering, and not to be flippant about it, but tell us about, like, are there situations where, say, the person who's going to the hostel, like, wants to die, but maybe their family members don't think they're ready, or vice versa, that, like, the family members might be eager for this person to pass along, but they don't want to go? Like, is it always everybody's just in agreement about the person going?
I mean, it just runs the absolute gamut of human nature. So all of the things that you described. And there is one book that I think I cite at the end of the book when I'm talking about all the different things that I looked at, called Dying the Good Death. And I actually did not read that book. I looked at it for the visuals. I didn't read it because the author, Christopher Justice, actually, it's a true ethnography. He went and he stayed in one of these places and he interviewed the families. And he was giving really detailed stories about each family. And I didn't want to read it and inadvertently be influenced by that. So I didn't actually read it. But everything that you describe, you might have somebody who says, yeah, I'm ready to die. And they're really not. They're like hale and healthy and et cetera, but they're insisting. You might have a family who says, oh, you're ready to die, even though the person's like, I don't think I am. I think I have plenty of time. It can run the gamut from the ideal, where you have somebody who truly knows their moment is about to come and has a family who's very supportive and is able to be there with them the entire time. It's one end of the spectrum. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, where you might have a family who just needs to get rid of this extra, at this point, body in their house and just dumps them in the death hostel. That's why these places have really specific rules about how you're not allowed to just leave somebody there. You have to have at least one family member there. There are time limits attached with it. The people staying in the hostel, it's like one of the big things that I really respected about the culture is that it's a pilgrimage. So inherent within a pilgrimage is you're not there to have a good time. So the family members, they're not supposed to be going out and like eating from like the like street snack places. They're not supposed to be going to the movies or like, doing whatever sightseeing. They're there to help that person like complete that passage, because these death hostels, like there's no sort of hospice care. There's really nothing. It's like a bare concrete room. Maybe there's a bed in there, maybe a couple of water pots or whatever, but there's nothing. You have to bring all of your own stuff. You have to like find your own food. You have to do it all. You're just really getting the shelter, and that's it. So the idea of all these stories, and talking about that initial outline where for this book that I wanted to write that wouldn't write itself, in the beginning it was supposed to be like exploring the stories of all of these different guests, like going in there, and one of them included somebody who was like, yep, I'm going, and kind of holding it as like a knife above their family member's head, like, I could go at any minute, so you need to be doing this. So on paper, it seems like a great book, and I think somebody else could probably do a great job of writing it, but I wasn't supposed to be that person.
Oh my gosh. There was a question. Grace Talusan is on she's in the chat. She's watching, and she asked a question a while back. I don't know if we can put it up on screen or not, but it was about how your own views of death evolved over the course of writing the book. And I guess I want to sneak my own question in as a writer on that, which is that I know it took you a long time, maybe 7-8 years to write the book. And one question I have about that is just more generally beyond that topic. You're changing over time. Over the course of 7-8 years, a person changes a lot. And how do you have a coherent point of view or aesthetic in a book that took that long to create, and when you might have gone through many, many life events and you're just not the same person you were a decade ago, maybe when you first thought of the book?
It was about 10 years, I think, when it's all said and done, maybe even more. And I mean, you're right, 10 years, especially when, I started this book in my late 20s and I'm now in my late 30s, that's a pivotal moment of time where your ethos and your perspective and things are changing. Weirdly, in terms of in terms of making sure the book was kind of seamless throughout in that point of view, of course, my perspective has changed. And if anything, I think it's veered to more just in terms of being just a more empathetic person. Right. And really leaving the judginess behind. I think I was probably a really judgy person, definitely in my teens. And it was something I had to like weed out of myself. Like I had to be really self-aware of it. But I tried to bring that empathy into this book. I think, you know, my viewpoint about death is something that's constantly evolving and shifting. But I wonder if at the core, it possibly has remained the same. If anything, Mark, I think I've come to the conclusion that none of us really know anything about anything. We're all just trying to muddle our way as best as we can, you know, be good people and be good to the people around us. I have my own beliefs about death. I don't want to say too much about it. You know, one thing I was really careful with this book is even though I wanted to bring a Hindu sensibility to it, I never wanted to be proselytizing or like taking the sanctimonious tone, because when I see books like that, I instantly glaze over and shut down. Like, because I'm just one of those nobody tells me what to do people. So whenever I sense a book trying to convince me of something, it's like, no, game over. I'm not going to participate in that. So I tried really hard to not do that either. So it's difficult for me to talk about death because it is inextricable from my own spiritual belief and foundation. So I find it hard for me to talk about it without kind of wandering into that realm and hopefully not making somebody uncomfortable and being like, oh, she's trying to tell me what to think or do.
Oh, no, I mean, the way I took the book was that, I mean, to be frank about it, the way I took it was, here is a meditation on death, which I think has the effect ultimately of inspiring a person to a kind of sharper experience of life. And you're talking about death from so many different points of view. There's not an ounce of preachiness in it. It's done with great humanity, and it's done, frankly, from a craft perspective on a character basis. So that was my experience. And
that's a huge relief and a huge compliment. Thank you.
Great. So look, we have a few minutes left here. We have a bunch of questions and I'm going to get to them, but I want to take a minute to talk about your publishing odyssey, which is really interesting. And I know we have a lot of writers who watch A Mighty Blaze as well. So I just want to speed through some of the details and then ask you a question. But you had gotten an agent who you loved. The book wasn't able to sell. You got so much positive feedback. And unfortunately, this is a common experience where people think they get an agent and they think, oh, it's over now. Like I've got it made. But then when you try to go to the next level, you get all these rejections, which in your case were extremely positive. And the book just couldn't sell. And everybody's saying, hey, you know, when you write something new, let me know. But then there was something you said, I don't know where I read this or heard you say this, but you said you felt compelled to knock on every last door. In other words, you weren't going to give up on the book. And I just want you to talk a little bit about this feeling of obligation to your work. And even after kind of a world of rejection and a world of people saying you're talented, but bring me the next book, you still said no. Tell me about that feeling of obligation.
You know, that feeling of obligation is inextricable from that Hindu idea of dharma, which is duty. And I'm going to try to talk about it again, staying away from like that whole preachy proselytizing thing that I talked about before. But that's ultimately my goal in life, is to live my life so that I am always completing my duty to everything in my life, whether that be people or tasks or whatever it is. But inextricable from that idea of dharma is that you should be completing your duty, but you should never think about what you're going to get out of it. You should never think about any reward, any fruit of that action. Your job as a human being is just to complete your actions, complete your obligations and your duty. And whatever happens after that is really none of your business. I had gotten to the point, and I will admit, I think in the beginning, as you said, when you get an agent, you know, this is something I had labored on for so long, all by myself. And we talked about how weird and secretive and mysterious I am. I didn't talk to anybody about it. So for me, I definitely got swept up when, you know, I got my amazing agent, Lee Feldman, and she was really excited about the book. We were both excited about it. You do get kind of swept up in the possibility of what might happen. Ultimately, all those years of rejection, about 2 years and countless rejections, the way the book eventually ended up making its way to publication was probably the most humbling, gratifying experience for me, because it was a great reminder to me to be like, why was I doing this to begin with? Was it because I had weird dreams about like sitting across from Oprah and talking about the book? Or was it because I had been working my way after my full-time job in the evening from 9 to 1 in the morning at night, all by myself, and just feeling really, really good because a great sentence had come out of me? Like, where was I really getting the satisfaction out of this, out of what I wanted to happen or what I was already doing? So the whole lesson made me very, very clear-eyed about it. What eventually ended up happening is I didn't go looking for an opportunity. I had that conversation with my agent where she still believed in the book, but nobody was going for it. So let's shelve it, and you need to move on with your writing life. And in that period of moving on, an email just dropped into my box. I was part of a creative writing listserv, and it was an advertisement for the Restless Books Prize in New Immigrant Writing. And when that email dropped in my box, I saw that as not, this is an opportunity to be published. I saw that as, here's something we're telling you about. We being the universe, whoever, here's something. You have to do something about it because you have a book and there's this opportunity and you have a duty to do something. You're not going to get anything out of it. This is not a promise of anything, but you have these two things that fit together and align, and it's now your job to push it forward. And that's truly how I thought of it. And I truly forgot about it once I submitted the book, because I didn't have to do anything. Like the book was already ready to go. I just had to write up a cover letter and, I just shot it out into the internet universe. And I really did forget about it because rejection had been so frequent. And I really saw that period of rejection, rightly or wrongly, but I saw that as like higher forces, the universe, whatever, being like, you've lost your way for a moment. You're thinking too much about what you might get out of it. And you need to remember that the whole point of all of this is the writing, is the process, is the discovery, is the journey. So I really kind of saw it as like a slap on the head to be like, don't forget what the point of all this is. So I submitted it with that lesson in mind, that was the point, and we're just doing this to do it. So it was really the shock of my life when many, many, many months later, I got an email telling me that I had won, because through the whole process, it was the first time in that book journey where I really did it without expecting anything and forgot about it. And I think for me, that was the key to unlocking everything. But it just was I would not go back and do it any other way, Mark. As difficult as it was at the time, it was an intense humbling that I feel like this has nothing to do with the outside world or whatever. I felt like I needed that internally. And it's not a lesson that I will soon forget, I hope. It's something that I think about often whenever I feel like my ego is kind of inflating beyond a proportion that I'm comfortable with.
What a beautiful, that is one of the most beautiful descriptions of a person's journey to being published that I've ever heard. And frankly, it's just one of the most clear and beautiful descriptions of an artist's own relationship with their work that I've ever heard. That was just, it just resonates with me, not only practically, but spiritually at the same time. I'm just not even going to touch that. That was just awesome. So that was so great. So I want to bring up, we have a lot of questions from the audience. So why don't we just start throwing up questions? Yeah. Okay, so this is from Alexandra Hoops. Hi, Alex. Death Hostels is such a gripping concept. Curious how Priyanka came up with the book's title. Was that the original title?
No, it was through the whole time up until finally meeting, my agent, Lee. The title of the book was A Good Death, which I loved. I was just enamored with that title, which is funny because I actually hate titles, Mark. I never remember titles. Like, I hate coming up with them for my own work. Usually, like, if I write a short story, when I'm done with it, I'll just search through the text and find 2 or 3 words that seem like they could make a cool title, and then I plop it up at the top. The reason we could not do A Good Death is soon after I found Lee, a nonfiction book about mortality had just been published with that title. So we figured we probably couldn't have something that was exactly the same. So I ended up just writing a bunch of titles down. I just made a big list and was like, this, I don't know, let's see what sounds good. And The City of Good Death was on there, and, you know, ended up polling some friends and mentors and my agent. And that's the one that we ended up coming up with. Somebody had asked me whether Banaras, like within the city internally, if they're known as the City of Good Death, and I don't think that they are. I think it's just something that I slapped together, and it seems like it's worked so far.
It definitely works, and I think it is frankly a much better title because it incorporates. I mean, the city. I mean, you. I'm sure you hear this all the time. The city is like a character in this book. I mean, it's important, I think, to draw that in and to tell people this isn't just. It's about a place as much as it is about the characters as well. All right, how about some other questions? Anything else?
It makes me so happy, Mark, to hear you say that the city was a character, because that was intentional. I wanted it to be that way. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, now that your book has been out for a couple of months, what has surprised you about the publishing process, in addition to the pandemic, unless you want to talk about that? It's from Grace again.
I think what has surprised me the most is probably the most pleasant of surprises, which is, one, the generosity of the writing community. I mean, just look at A Mighty Blaze. That's entirely volunteer run, and it's entirely through the generosity of all these people like you, Mark, and Jenna, who's moderating, just devoting your time just because you love books so much and you love stories and you want to be able to propel them forward. So I've been constantly blown away and surprised by people who've been like, yes, I'll read your 470 odd page book and blurb it, or, you know, yes, I'll write a review of it, or yes, I'll post about it. Just like, you know, that has been incredible. The other thing, and it perhaps surprises me, I don't know, maybe I'm a bit of a selfish bastard myself, but maybe that's why I'm surprised by all these people offering up their time, but I will pay it back. It will come around at some point. The other thing that's been a really pleasant surprise is the reaction in India, which you and I talked about a bit, Mark. But I had, I looked at Jenna, put that thought of a bit of a selfish bastard. I was really trepidatious about, you know, early on with the book, I knew it was going to be coming out from, you know, in India at exactly the same time that it would come out in the United States. And I was really trepidatious because of that lack of firsthand experience with Banaras, because I was not born or raised in India. You know, in America, people who are not Indian probably just think of me as Indian, but, you know, there's a difference depending, you know, when you actually go to the country. To them, you're not Indian, you're American, and everybody's right and everybody's wrong in a way. But I was really trepidatious. I took great care to be as considerate as possible when portraying everything. But at the end of the day, it's nothing really substitutes for firsthand knowledge. And I feared being seen as an outsider coming in, taking ownership of this very holy city and just making a story up about the place. Yeah. And like what actually happened has been so humbling and so gratifying. Just so many lovely, you know, messages I've gotten from readers in India, events I've been able to do, publicity I've been able to do. It is actually a bit shocking to me, because I'm still waiting. I'm waiting for somebody to come up to me and be like, hey, you got this and this and this wrong. And, you know, I'm actually kind of anticipating that moment in a weird way, almost as if it's like it's something due to me from the universe, that I committed this sin. And so when is my moment to redeem myself for doing that?
You know, one of the most interesting things about that is, you know, as I've been doing this show, I've spoken with so many authors, and a topic that comes up a lot is representation, because it's such a huge issue in publishing right now. And who has the right to tell what stories? And if you're from a different community, a different race, different ethnicity, can you write the story of a different race, ethnicity, and so on? And what I have found is that it's the people who are actually from that community from that race, from that ethnicity, who are often the most worried. It's like, so it's not the white author writing about a Black protagonist who is as worried as the Black author writing about a Black protagonist, worrying if they will get it right for their own Black community. And I feel some of that from you now as well.
That's so interesting. And you're right, now that I think about it, there is a lot of that. I wonder if that also has to do with just like lack of representation in these various communities anyway. So when you have a book come out, it's like you're the one book out, and suddenly people decide that you are the voice for everybody from that community. I was reading this interview with Colson Whitehead when he was talking about the Underground Railroad, and he would be doing, obviously pre-pandemic, so he would be doing these in-person events, and the audience would just ask him questions about everything with the Black community and Black culture. And he'd be like, whoa, guys, like, I'm the expert on this book. Like, not everything.
Right.
Like, I can't possibly be the voice for all of that. So I can totally see that anxiety and trepidation from that point of view. When you do have so few books and you're the one book that's out, then suddenly everybody's looking to you as if you are the expert on it all.
Right. Exactly. All right. Let's do one or two more quick questions before we run out of time. Given your many characters and subplots, do you work from an outline? And I know that you brought up, I just want to color this a little bit, that you brought up earlier that you did have an outline and you found that outline to be dead when you actually set about writing it. And I was so interested in that. And I'm just kind of curious, if you could just quickly, why was it dead? And ultimately, was there anything from that original outline that made it into the final work?
It was dead because I knew what was going to happen. There was no surprise left for me, and I was bored. Ultimately, if there was no surprise and I was bored, then it was like, well, what's the point of me writing this then? But, like, why would I write that then? Because I'm not so altruistic as to be like, I'm going to write for an audience. Like, no, it has to be all about me at some point. So let's be honest, Mark.
I understand.
At all times. But so this book was entirely organic. Once I found my entry point, which was this vision of these two boatmen out on the water, ensconced in fog, and they come upon this dead body. That was the entry point for me. That vision just like kind of flashed in my head at a certain point, and started with that image and just kept riding that wave as far as I could go. So I didn't know anything. It was like, in one interview, I talked about how it was very Shawshank Redemption, like tunneling through the concrete wall with the spoon, like trying to make my way through, and very often dead ends, wrong turns, got to turn right back around and try again. In terms of similarities with the outline, some of the characters, there's a character who shows up at the very, very end, Mark, and you'll know because you've read the book, but the character who shows up at the very end was supposed to be the main character originally. so like small...
I have to think about that for a second, but go ahead.
Yep. It's supposed to be told from that character's point of view. Wow. So small things like that, like I think really just like maybe the names of the characters and kind of the initial setup of who was going to be in the hostel. But I mentioned before, a lot of the book was supposed to be about the stories of the people who were dying, who were visiting. And as you know, because you read the book, that's actually pretty minimal. There's really not that much of that in there at all. It turns out to be about the people who are running the hostel and the people living in the city.
Yeah, and just one other thing quick. We'll do one last question. But, one thing that I loved about the way I've heard you describe the conception of the book is the outline was DOA. Then you read Midnight's Children and got this electric charge. And then also key to the conception of the book as it is now is that you had this kind of vision of this body drudged out of a river. And I have always found those kinds of stories interesting. You hear them here and there, where an author just says, I had this daydream of a dog who was flying 3 feet above the ground, and now I'm a Pulitzer Prize winner. And it's like, I had to know, why does this dog fly? But I just find that interesting as a way that novelists come to their work, and their way into the work is often this completely irrational, dreamlike vision of something that I guess just speaks to something profound in their subconscious.
I mean, what else could it be? I don't know. I mean, certainly with me, when that image popped into my head, I was at the end of my rope. I had tried everything. I felt like time was ticking and I needed to get going. And it really was this sense of, I got nothing else. So let's just write this down. And in the process, it was such a vivid image when it flashed into my head. And one thing I'm really proud of is I feel like, it's very, very rare, as you know, Mark, it's very rare where you get it on the page exactly as you initially saw it in your head. And I feel like it matches pretty closely with what I saw in my head. It really was that vivid. And I think the key for me was just how fun it was, how easy and natural it felt. And it was something where I could use it to propel me forward into the unknown. Because again, I didn't know, once I committed to that image, I was equally committing myself to walking away from that outline and walking into the darkness and being like, I really don't know how this book is going to go, who the characters are, what the story is about, how long it's going to take me, how long it's going to be, any of it. And we talked about it was 10 years later for me to emerge from the darkness, turn around and be like, oh, that's what I was doing. That's what was happening.
As you describe this, the image comes to my mind of somebody who you want to go across an ocean and you've built this big fancy boat to go across. And then the day you're supposed to set sail, you walk up and you say, nah, I'm just going to swim. and off you go. That's, I don't know. It's, I love how you describe the process.
I have to tell you, Mark, because what you just said echoes almost exactly my dad. My dad is incredible at giving me pep talks when I don't even know I need it. And he's incredible at discerning what I need to hear when I don't even know what I need to hear. But I think 2 or 3 years into writing this book, I was drowning. I was flailing. I had graduated. I was in a full-time job. Like, I didn't know what I was doing with my life, much less with the story. And at the time, there was, I think it was a 16-year-old girl who decided she was going to circumnavigate the globe. Do you remember this? Like she had like a solar powered boat and she decided she was just going to set off in the solar powered boat and see if she could do it. And my dad sat me, well, he didn't even sit me down. He just happened to find me at a certain point. And he was like, right now, you're like that girl. You set off with so much hope and enthusiasm and excitement. And suddenly you've realized you're in the middle of the ocean and you're alone and there's nobody around you. And he said to me, you just have to have the hope that you're going to make it to the end, just like that girl. So what you just said was a wonderful echo of that.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Okay, so we do have to wrap now. Now, listen, I have one last question that I always ask to every one of my authors, but it's interesting because I'm going to preface it with you actually, it's about the kind of reaction that you'd like to inspire from your work. But I just want to preface it by saying that, like, I have read something that you once said about what you're looking for in a book. And you said, the thrill I'm looking for as a reader is the feeling of being so completely immersed that you feel as if you've suffered a grave loss when you finally finish reading, and you just never want to experience the end of the book. So I thought that was just a beautiful description of what other books have meant to you and kind of how you like to feel at the end of your best reading experiences. But so with that said, here's my question that I always ask every author who comes on. So imagine that you have a reader who is the ideal reader for this book, who is just receiving the book in just the way you would hope that your book would be received in your wildest dreams. And this ideal reader, they get to the end of The City of Good Death and they close the book. Describe for me in a word or at most a phrase, what is the feeling that they have at that moment?
Satiated.
That is good. Good and accurate.
I hope
that is how I felt.
Yeah. That's the feeling that I hope for. And if they're in front of me, I would just say thank you. And thank you to you, Mark, and anybody in the audience who's read the book or is hoping to read the book, because really that's what it's all about at the end of the day. The writing experience was mine, but once it's published, it's out to everybody else. And I'm so cognizant and humbled and gratified by anybody who picks it up. Whether they finish it or whether they decide it's not for them, they're still devoting their time to it. And that is no small thing. I'm very cognizant of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, now that you say it, The book is a feast, and it's not only a feast, but it feels like it's a feast that's being served by somebody who deeply cares about my experience of the feast. So satiated is just a perfect word for it.
There was a lot of food in there, which Nathan, my editor, was really happy about. Like in revising, I kept adding food, and he was like, "I love all these food bits you're adding."
Oh, the food is great. Okay, so we have to wrap there, folks. This beautiful, beautiful feast-like book, which will satiate you, The City of Good Death. Please buy it. Just buy it right now. We're going to put links in the chat to how to buy it. Priyanka, congratulations so much. Thank you so much for coming, and congratulations on the book.
This has been such a pleasure. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mighty Blaze, and thank you, Jenna. Thank you, everybody, for watching as well.
Great. Okay, folks, so we'll be back in 2 weeks on The Thoughtful Bro with Sanjana Sathian talking about Gold Diggers, which will soon be a Mindy Kaling series on TV. It's going to be very exciting. We'll see you guys all then.